Good evening, USA. Good morning, Asia. And good night, Europe. Welcome to the World Today's discussion series hosted by the UCLA Center for Global Management. Today's event is supported by our Anderson graduating class of 2022. Thank you. Over the next hour, we shall discuss with our distinguished guest, Jim Moffatt, about a question that has been on many people's mind over the last few years. The question is globalization ending? Before I introduce our guest, Jim Moffatt, let me say a few words about this topic. Globalization began with Ronald Reagan's presidency in the 80s. At the time, I was learning Japanese. I was studying the Toyota production system. Then, 90s. In the 90s, when the offshoring, the outsourcing movements gaining momentum. So I have to brush up my Chinese and also visit the manufacturers in China in anticipating that China will enter the WTO. But things changed. Over the last few years, the trade war between the United States and China, the COVID pandemic, the port congestions in Los Angeles, the war in Ukraine. Of course, there's sanctions against Russia. But there's also Russia's retaliation by turning off the gas pipe to Europe. Now, all these events really inspired BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink, to issue in his letter this year, saying that globalization is ending. Now, global leaders are talking about deglobalization. The Economist magazine called it slowbalization. So, is globalization per se? To examine this question, I'm delighted to have Jim Moffatt to share his insight and wisdom with us this evening. Jim needs no introduction, but please allow me to do the honor. Jim is currently the president of JSM Advisors, who's advising private equity and venture capital firms. Before this venture, Jim has over 30 years of experience at the Deloitte Consulting, serving as the vice chairman and global CEO. He was managing Deloitte's services worldwide. More importantly, he is our proud Anderson alum. Also, he's a prominent member of our UCLA Anderson School Board of Advisors. Jim, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Chris.
To get started, can you share with us about your journey? After you received your MBA from the Anderson School, how do you come about being so global? What is your journey like? Can you share with us?
Well, let me first start out by when Chris and I first met, we were both a lot younger because I was in his class back when he was a brand new professor. And even back then, he was probably the favorite professor in the class, right? I mean, yeah, it was always, if he didn't win the professor of the year, he was right there every year. So we both had, well, you don't have gray hair. You got a little more hair. I am more gray and less hair, right? So, my journey around global was maybe a little slow. Based on the way, when I joined consulting was still pretty early in its maturation. And so a lot of the work I did was very US-centric. I did a lot of work in healthcare, did a lot of turnaround work. But as I started to get more mature in my professional growth, I started to work with multinationals. You started to realize in our business that our clients, particularly for strategy and transformation, which is what I did, they expected you to have capability consistently around the globe. It wasn't enough just to be in one place because they were global and they were going to markets globally, and they wanted partners who could do that with them. And so I started to get aware of it. When I led the client program, building the client program for Deloitte is when it really hit me in spades. And so I was already pretty in tune to it when I took over as CEO. And one of the things I was chartered with was, creating a strategy that would carry us into the next 20 years, 10 years, 20 years. I was blessed growing up under great operators, acknowledged, but not strategists, and they asked me, really to do that. One of the biggest holes we found in our model was global. So even when I was running the US, we were extremely aggressive around globalizing our business and making investments because that's where the markets were and that's where our clients were going. So that's kind of my journey, but it was a slower one. I will tell you, just coming back to that, and I believe this even more now than ever, which global is, from the seat you're sitting in, if you don't get immersed in some way around global, I think you're missing one of the most important things you can do in business school. Even when I was running the US CEO, because the world was so interconnected, I spent more time looking at macro and economic and geopolitical trends than I did at the US domestic market. So.
Well, thank you. Well, you said global is important and also interconnected.
Yep.
Got that. But then what's so special about managing a company become more global, especially when English became the lingua franca? So why do we need to be so global? If you speak English, that should be sufficient, wouldn't it?
First of all, there's not, in my view, not only for our business, but for the clients we serve, there's not one answer for global for every company. It depends on if you're a B2C company, a B2E company. It depends a lot on what industry you're in. When we went to market through industry verticals, if we looked at the markets that were important for those industries, they would light up different geographies depending on what kind of business it was. Life sciences was different than auto. So you have to think about what is it about your business that you want, where there's value in sharing it globally, and then tailor it based upon that. But I don't think there's a way that you can avoid, at the end of the day, spending time and understanding the culture. I think what made us successful, as we looked at it, the first time I made a foray, kind of building a practice globally, it was, I won't say it was a failure because we knew it was going to be in many ways our sandbox. But you had to figure out the right formula around what is it that we can share that's of value globally. For us, it was IP and talent, but you had to connect locally and you had to spend time and we had to build capability locally. So I would say that it's great to be able to communicate to some degree in English, but you also have to respect, listen, and then build capability at the connect point close to the client.
Well, thank you. So that means context is very important.
100%.
It could be in terms of the industry, could be in terms of the culture. Even though you can speak the same language, it doesn't mean that you have a really clear understanding of the situation.
And Chris, to that point, I would think you should go in understanding that no matter what you did, for somebody like me who grew up in the US, that I will never understand the market, the culture, or the dynamics like somebody who grew up there. And be extremely respectful of that. And the way I would talk about it to my team was, we have brilliant people everywhere. The markets have different level of maturity. Their practices have different levels of maturity. But don't underestimate how smart they are and how well they understand their market and their customers. And so if we go in and are disrespectful of that, then we will never be successful. So that whole point of listening, being appreciative, bringing what you can, but not being, I've got all the answers, just listen to me. In fact, we tried that. We tried bringing the Army from the US, our first foray into global, and it just never took. It just never took. We went back in a different way to that point.
Well, thank you. That means in order to be successful in a global environment, you have to really have open mind and open heart, right? So now, but then things are changing now.
Yeah.
Because now there are a lot of geopolitical tensions, there are disputes, there's also war. Now, many people are thinking, well, maybe this is not working that well, especially in the context of some politicians. So they want to become more local instead of global. Now, then the question now, some people say, well, maybe deglobalization is a trend. In your view, do you think that globalization is ending? If not, what kind of shape it will take?
So this kind of reminds me, I said this, Tony, the Mark Twain quote about the message of my demise has been greatly exaggerated. I don't think global is ending. I think it's changing. Global's always been hard, and it's always required some nuance. And I think what you're going to see are some fundamental shifts. Some of which is around the geopolitical tension, and I think the way the world will probably start to operate. You're seeing this either more regionally or multilaterally with different kinds of trade agreements. But part of this also gets down to, if you really look at this strategically, I think countries, and maybe, and I mentioned this to Tony, maybe a little bit of the dynamic of the public markets where you're forced to take shorter term positions. But in most things, we tried not to be dependent on one geography for anything that was important to our supply chain. And so if you think about what's happened, over time, and I think China was partly around the labor arbitrage, but also because they're trying to get access to the customer base by putting operations there. But essentially what we did, and a lot of these companies did, is that they made themselves solely dependent on one geography for key components. I told Chris, we did a piece of research on this a decade ago around about reshoring. I actually talked about it at the Detroit Economic Forum. And what happens if you look at it over time, the cost differential of labor actually shifts as you start to build the middle class. And so the differential that's there initially starts to dissipate. By the way, that's a very good thing because you start to make consumers that are able to buy your products. But when you also start to look at all the other factors that weigh in to the cost and complexity of the supply chain, what you realized was that even back 10 years ago, and this is before some of the geopolitical dynamics, that the business case around offshoring was very, very different. It certainly said you should be diversifying, and in part, our pet message was much of it you should build closer to your customer. And so some of that was done, but not all of it. And now then you factor in kind of the strategic components and defining what's really strategic. I used to always look at what's your secret sauce? What is it that really truly differentiates you from everybody else? And what is it that you need to have control over, whether it's your own building or tightly vertically integrated? And make sure that you're not in any way dependent on somebody else or one source for that. That would logically say things like semiconductors and other things as the world has shifted strategically, you ought to be thinking about how you get those in a situation where you're not dependent on another party, particularly one who may be adversarial to you over time. So I think it's gotten more complicated, but the last thing I'll say around this is when we looked at the world, we were very clear. And our model for consulting, you're looking for mature markets. Consulting is the last professional service that gets utilized by major companies. So we look for large markets, and we look for places where there was a mature kind of business environment. And so it became very clear where we were going. We were chasing growth. And I don't care what company you're in, whether you're a VC-backed, private equity-backed, you're looking for large, addressable markets. And where there are customers, there will be companies trying to figure out how to access those customers. That makes sense.
Yes, perfectly. So I think that in terms of you talk about supply chain resilience, is try to make sure that you diversify your supply base, maybe through reshoring. Now, this ties in with the current climate in the US.
Yep.
President Biden signed the IRA, being trained in British environments. This is not the term we use normally. It's an Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah.
And also the CHIPS Act
Yeah.
is trying to reshore some of the semiconductor manufacturing. So that is a very good move. But there is a challenge. This is a problem because over decades of offshoring and outsourcing, we do not have the capability to build the nanochips. There's especially the 3 nanometer nanochips. We don't have the technology. Now we need to rebuild that capability. So there are some challenges. At the same time, the Chinese scientists in the LA Times article that I wrote 2 days ago, and they're leaving. Then the question is what does it take to rebuild that capability that the chips was invented in the United States, and yet we cannot build the latest technology? What does it take to get there?
It's going to take a longer term view, and this is where China. If you spend time in China, how many people have spent time in China? Okay, you can sense that China is playing multi-dimension chess and taking a very long term view, versus the U.S. is we're as innovative as we are, as much capital as we have, as sophisticated as we are. It is very, very hard to have that kind of long-term, whether it's political, we've all seen that, or even in corporations. You're going to need a CEO and a board in companies that understand the strategic element of this and are willing to invest long. I was telling Tony earlier about one of the investments I made in our practice in Germany. Now we're a private partnership, but the partners I made this investment was a 10-year investment, meaning that the partners who were funding it weren't ever going to see any money from that investment. But we made the case that it was so strategically fundamental to our practice that we needed to do it. And I got 100% agreement. And it really changed the game for us. I think you're going to need a similar type of either public-private partnership to do that, or a very bold CEO and board that sees the long game. Because it is, I just can't imagine as a CEO looking at my stakeholders and saying, I know this is really strategic to us, and by us as a company, but also to our customers. And yet, it's not good for the short-term earnings, and so I'm not going to make that investment. And yes, as a result of that, we're going to be dependent on X, Y, or Z for that product. So I think it's going to take some bold leadership. I think it's going to be some changes in governance, and I also think it's going to take a public-private partnership in some way to drive that.
That is very interesting thought in terms of partnership between the governments, public and private, because in terms of long-term view, it's very difficult to be supported in the current capitalist environment. So, for example, Toyota developed the Prius engine. At that time, the gasoline price is at all-time low. No one in the same mind would buy a Prius. But Toyota kept going. It took them over 10 years to break even. Very few companies in the US can afford to do that. For example, the electric car actually was not started by Tesla. It was started by GM, the SC1. So basically, they cannot afford to take the long-term view. That's why it was suspended. Now, how do you think this will take up the momentum in terms of have established a relationship with the private-public partnership? That is not a common business model in the US setting. But in Japan, they have this kind of setting. It's called Daisan sector, the third sector. Mm-hmm. We don't have that. So what does it take to make that happen?
Boy, now you're talking about solving political dynamics in this country. I'll take on big challenges, but I'm not going to step into that one. And this is where I think it's going to require, I think it's going to require I hate to say this, some degree of coming together of political leadership around this to make that happen. I also though think this is where the private capital comes in quite well, right? This is why, the reason Tesla was able to become what it became is because you had investors who had a longer view on the opportunity, and they were measuring success through very different metrics. And you had a brilliant CEO. Maybe he's gotten a little provocative lately. I won't go there, but a brilliant CEO. So I think it's going to require hopefully less fractionalization in the political environment and more, people reaching accommodations around these big strategic elements. But I also think that the business community is going to have to assert a very different leadership role than we have collectively. And this is where I think, the generation of leaders that's coming out of, business school and academia today can play a big role in shaping that. I mean, the short-term nature, and I saw this you see this around downturns or any kind of dynamic where you start to see the CEOs and boards that are so worried about, kind of stabilizing and not going south that they stop investing and they lose the courage and the confidence to invest. My experience in every downturn is the companies who perform best coming out were the ones that were in some way able to maintain their investment in that longer term view in the face of what was going on. So I think it's going to take hopefully more from the government and coming together, but I actually think business is going to have to take a much different view around this and drive some of those changes. Again, this is a headline from Musk, but his point around his robot, right, where he was bristling in Twitter, and I don't think that's a great place to do this, but his point when he asked about, you want to see essentially the business case, he said, look, if you can't figure this out, then I'm not going to waste my time on you, and I'm not here just to work the share price, and so I do think that I'm not trying to elevate him, but I do think you need CEOs and boards that are willing to take a longer term play, understand the ramifications, and invest through it.
Well, that's very true because right now the world is so divided and polarized. So in order to get there, that means that different stakeholders need to come up with a common vision, right?
Yeah.
To rebuild a stronger supply chain for the nation. So I think that President Biden is setting the momentum, and let's hope that there will be some wise investments. Some of them would actually take a good shape. Now, let's moving on. Now, let's take a look at the energy crisis that Europe is facing because winter's coming and gas is in short supply in Europe. And some European companies, like the steel plants, they have to shut down some of the facilities. And also the biggest chemical companies, BASF, and also shut down some of its operations. Now, moving forward, this is not a simple fix can be established. So how do you see that in terms of economy in Europe first, before we move on to other regions?
Well, I think Europe is perhaps going to have the hardest slog over the next several years. For lots of different reasons. I mean, the EU is not as cohesive as we've seen this. I think with Brexit, that's also caused some problems. But with the energy crisis, that's going to exacerbate it even further. There aren't, it's one of those things where you realize that I didn't figure out how to diversify something, and now I'm kind of stuck. So I don't think there's a great short-term answer, Chris. I think they're going to have to do lots of things, much of which is probably not going to make the politicians very, very popular, both in terms of greatly curtailing demand, starting to push off some of the bold moves they were doing around climate change and having to access different kinds of energy in the short term. But eventually they've got to figure out a way to replenish and develop different supplies of oil and other things while they build out their more energy neutral solutions. So I think for the next 2 to 3 years it's going to be pretty ugly, Chris, and I think they can do lots of things to adjust it. I mean, you've just seen right now they say trying to get their stocks up to 90% the level before the holidays, and I'm not overly confident about their ability to do that and what it would take to do that. But that's kind of what you need just to be able to get through the cold winter in Europe. So I don't have a great answer, but it's going to be hard.
Yeah, well, but I think there's some good news though.
Okay.
Germany is building up some facilities to store the liquefied natural gas,
Good.
and they're hoping that United States can ship some there. Now, so basically that's, yes, the Brexit actually created tension between UK and Europe. but things actually improved because of the war in Ukraine. Actually brought United States and Europe force a stronger relationship. That is encouraging.
That's been a big
But
plus.
there is something worrisome. China and Russia are trying to expand the BRICS memberships, and Iran and Argentina, they just applied for the membership. Now we can see that in terms of global trade, it's really splitting up into different trading blocks. Now, when you have different types of trading blocks, it may destabilize, if you will, the rule-based world order. Now, I know that you advise a lot of venture capital firms. Given this situation, what is your advice to them where to invest?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think I have always been leery of Russia as a place to invest, and largely because I just never felt that market was stable enough given some of the complications in the leadership of that country. China, I was very bullish on a few years ago. If you go to China, it's the only country in the world I felt the degree of innovation that I did in the U.S. And it was remarkable how fast that country pivoted and the energy that they could put behind that, and some of the things that the government provided. But I also think that world's changed, and so I think you need a very different, as big a market as China is. I think you need to put a very different lens on that. What I start to see is things evolving more along regional lines. You're going to see much more, I think, trading within Asia Pac and Europe and North America. But I also think you're going to see much more direct multilateral agreements that start to emerge. But I don't think it's going to be as simple or clean. I think India is going to be interesting to watch because India right now is kind of playing between both the U.S. and Russia. And I think at some point they're going to have to make some choices. China, I think China is savvy enough to be cautious around Russia. In my view, I could be wrong on that. But I do think that over time, the growth, I don't think this has changed. The growth was shifting west. And so I think you're going to see a lot of VCs looking west, but I think that west may be less interesting going to China right now. Most of the people I talk to are very, very cautious around China, largely because the promise of China didn't really materialize for many. There were big markets there, but getting access to it, I know we're going to talk a little bit about the trade war, but I think that was an abject failure. I think the issue has always been around access to IP and access to the markets, and I don't think we ever solved that. And so I think you have to think about China very differently than we did a few years ago. Hopefully over time that'll change and it'll come back and be a great partner, but certainly a fierce competitor with some very different value sets than we have in this country.
Very true, because in terms of the China business model is quite different from the US model. So now we've seen that. Now, but China is also changing. As you pointed out earlier, that China has a lot of really fantastic innovations from WeChat to Tencent, Alibaba and whatnot. Yep. But things also change over the last couple of years. Look at Ant Financials. Yep. Now China is going to push the state-owned enterprises to get in to compete with the private sector. Now, then it's a very interesting proposition. That means using the public sector to compete with the private sectors. Now, in that sense, do you think it will work? What kind of challenges do you see it will happen?
Well, our first foray into China was focused on SOEs, and I think it's going to be the same challenge you would have here in the U.S. I mean, I think it's going to be one of the things to watch with China is, as they've started to control some of the innovation, is have they lost what really fueled their growth and emergence? Because unless something has changed in the SOEs, the capabilities and the innovation are just not anywhere on par with what you saw in companies like Tencent and Alibaba. I mean, I was blown away by Alibaba when I met with them, and just how innovative and aggressive and how fast they were moving. And same with Tencent. And I think that's so. I think it will be. It'll be masked, but I think it won't. I don't see it as being successful. And I think the risk that China has is cutting off their growth engine, which I think really fueled a lot of their emergence in the world. So, yeah.
Now, right now, let's talk about global employment.
Yep.
In the US, we cannot find workers.
Yeah.
I don't know where they are. No one's working, right? But in China, they have a huge unemployment rate because the economic downturn. So there is a really imbalance of workforce. In economics, they'll think, oh, the labor force is really fluid, it's flexible. But we've discovered it's not. Then the question is now, people work from home, they're not sure they want to work. And then in China, also the younger generation, they're lying flat. No one wants to work. Only the old people work.
Yeah.
Then the question is how are we going to change the dynamics? How can we mobilize the global young generations to work?
Wow. I've had trouble with my own house. What are you talking about? No, look, maybe I'm more optimistic about youth. I've seen this every generation is different, and I always hear about one generation saying the next generation's lazy, and they don't do it the way we did it, and the reality is that I think the way people value work and what they're thinking about is different. But I haven't seen people not willing to work or with a work ethic. I just don't think they're willing to do that. Like, if you told me I was going to be on a plane 42 weeks, 45 weeks a year, and fly on initially on Sundays and get home on Friday, I'd tell you you're crazy, right? But that was the expectation. I think I do think that there are workers to be accessed. I do think that companies are going to have to be a lot. We had to pivot what we did to engage our people every 3 to 4 years. And our secret sauce was we got our best people to help design what we needed to do. And I think if you're a company today and you're not thinking about how do I engage and recruit and differentiate the experience for these people, you're going to have trouble. Now, all the dislocation that happened around COVID, I'm going to kind of put that on the side. But I do think the world will stabilize, and you're going to have a lot of very smart people that want to do something with purpose and impact. And what I see young people being less willing to take roles that they don't see that they're able to contribute and grow professionally. So I'm more optimistic about you. I would also say with the gig economy, there's lots of different ways to get people employed that just look different than the way we have. And so, maybe part of this is I spend so much time with early stage companies. If I look at the companies I work with, probably a quarter of them are early stage companies. And you just see the energy and the enthusiasm around the people in this. I get energized and optimistic. I do think you have to go to where the talent is, though, right? And there's probably a couple elements, Chris. I'll go on this because talent. I spent more. After the first 2 years, we had our strategy kind of set and people understood it, were aligned and kind of moving with urgency. Half of my leadership's time was spent on talent. And I don't think companies spend enough time on that topic. I think it's one that is it's starting to emerge, but probably given how strategic the talent equation is and how complicated it's gotten. Like for us, we were always looking for talent. The reason we first went into India wasn't an arbitrage play; it was a talent play. We got access to, thousands of brilliant people that we wouldn't have had access to, and I think that's the other thing around these other markets that you see. So I'm more optimistic it's there, but I do think along the lines of the investment horizon, I think companies are going to have to think differently around how they recruit, attract, develop, and engage their employees and feel that accountability is a top priority.
This is really true. We need to create more jobs that is exciting, purposeful, and cool jobs. But would there be so many jobs for everybody, especially in the era of digitization, automation, robotics, AI? So now the question is can the companies create that many cool jobs for the young talents, especially universities train so many talented people? Then do we have enough jobs for all these talents globally?
Yeah, look, I'm pretty bullish on that. Now, the challenge around that gets into a deep recession, right? Where you have, which is, by the way, buckle your seatbelts for the next, I think, 18 months. But I've never seen innovation, and you look historically, what happens around innovation and growth is it creates new opportunities, it creates bigger markets. Look, as we pivoted our model and started adding and broadening from just kind of strategy and operations, and including technology, what people were concerned about in our practice was that we were going to get commoditized in certain ways. And what was kind of clear to us as we looked at it, it was actually going to make the pie much bigger. And so yes, we do more technology work, but it also drive a lot more strategy and transformation work. And I think that's what happens around this. As you create more growth, more opportunity, you create new jobs. Now, what it does requires a very different workforce. And so that's where academia, but also companies come in. And we did this work right about the time I was retiring, just looking at the future of work. And the early studies we did was 40 to 50% of companies' employees were going to have to change in terms of what they needed for the future jobs. And so that you don't want to reinvent your employee base every year. So you've got to figure out how to do that. So, Chris, that's kind of my view anyway.
Thank you. Well, you're very true in terms of the future of work is changing. The world is changing, and the globalization, the mindset is also changing. Now, I'm going to ask you the last question before we open up to the floor. Okay. Now, given this context, how should we prepare our MBA students, our talent in the future? What is your advice?
Well, again, I think I said at the very beginning, I'd make sure every student gets some exposure to global as part of an MBA education. I don't see how you can be a senior leader today in an organization without a global mindset. And so it doesn't necessarily mean your first job is going to be global or you're going to go do a job overseas, but I guarantee you, if you work for virtually every early stage company I'm working for is looking at global already. I mean, that's one of the things around SaaS, right? You don't have to, you don't, it's a lot easier to go global than it used to be, and particularly on the B2C side. But for multinationals, I guarantee you multinationals, every one of them is going to have a global footprint. It won't be the same as it was 5 years ago. It's going to change along the things we're talking about, but it will be global. And understanding of how to do that and an appreciation for the cultures and the intelligence in those different markets and what it takes is, getting some exposure to that. Absolutely. I would also say earlier in your career, and again, it doesn't have to be an overseas assignment, but do something that in whatever project, whatever you do that has something to do with global, just so you get some appreciation for the dynamics. I was lucky even early on. Actually, I forgot this. My first client was Toshiba, and we were doing a project in strategy and for their medical division. And I remember they had the CFO was a Japanese national, and the CEO came over for the first readout of the strategy session. Obviously, it was all. We had somebody translate, but he also fell asleep during the meeting, right? And I luckily had somebody tell me beforehand, this is going to happen, right? And just don't think it's part of it. They explained a little bit around how, the CEO wants to be treated, never wanted to be asked something they couldn't answer, et cetera. There was a whole lot of dynamic to it, but just an appreciation, because in the U.S. that would be viewed very differently. And so understand and appreciate what the different cultures have and make sure you do that as part of your curriculum and early in your career too.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. I think it's very true. In terms of being global, especially in today's world, we have a hybrid workforce. Some are online, some are offline, because offline can be anywhere in the world. So in the case, having this kind of acute awareness of the differences, because you are not meeting this person face to face, you're meeting them over Zoom. Then the question, how do you work with the global workforce? That is very crucial in terms of this kind of a tacit understanding of each other is very important. So thank you. Now, in your time, I'm going to open up to the floor, and I would like to welcome you to come up to the mic and ask Jim's questions. Come on, fire away.
And my question is related to labor as well. So we've had big semiconductor companies like Intel, Texas Instruments, Micron announce big fabs in the US. One thing I haven't heard a lot is the next step in the process, which is packaging, testing, and I think that requires a lot of labor and low-cost labor.
Yep.
How do you think these companies are going to be able to compete once there's more of that workforce here in the US against companies that are doing the same thing for much lower cost, given how much our labor is pretty, unemployment rate is 3.7,
Yep.
and we demand much higher rates per hour. Any advice or comments on how we will, US companies, be able to compete in that space?
This is where I'm a big fan on immigration. And if you look at, you look at the growth, it's one of the biggest challenges in countries that don't allow immigration. It's been a big engine for growth. And so I'm hopeful that we will get more realistic around how you solve that equation to balance out, some of that within our own country. I do think we're going to have to get, again, innovative and longer term thinking around the economics of this to some degree. But that's what I'm hoping for. It's gotten really crazy in terms of, visas and other things. It's gotten much, much harder and making it more difficult. But that's where I'm hoping it goes.
Okay, thank you.
We're living in the era of digitalization, and in next 30 years, almost 100% in our planet will have access to the internet. And what do you think? It means that we will live in the global world without any borders, without any some unions, trade unions, and people will migrate to metaverse. And what is your projection? How our world will develop next 30 years in this direction?
I guess, and maybe I'm too old for this one, but I don't think it's going to be that permeable. I still think they're going to be, there'll be more restrictions around some of the trade. I don't think it's going to be completely free form for a lot of the reasons we said. I think there's going to be, geopolitical kind of dynamics that start to put regulations around what can be done where. So I do think there'll be much more technology, much more digitalization, much more access, hopefully much more access, particularly to younger, people that have not had access and can help with education. But I don't see it going all the way there. But again, maybe I'm just too old for that, and it's this generation that has to get there. I haven't seen anything that's quite gotten there, and the metaverse is it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves. Some of the forays there right now, it's hard to see how they're going to monetize.
Thank you.
So my question is this. Every historian would say that globalization comes cyclic. So according to the question of is globalization passé, do we really think that this fourth globalization, let's say, is it going to be over in the next years? Or do you still think that it's not over yet? It will keep going for, one more decade. And how do you think the end of the globalization or the end of the globalization would affect business, whether you're working in a big company or in a small company?
Yeah, and just say I did reach out to some of my network just to test kind of where I was thinking. So I talked to people in Australia and the UK and Japan and Canada. I didn't get to my colleagues in China or India, and all said the same thing. The global's not going away. That it's changing. There is clearly a view around some of the geopolitical dynamics and more regionalization and more nationalization that's going to play in. So you'll see some different trade flows and different kind of ways in which supply chains are constructed, probably more bilateral and multilateral agreements, but people didn't see it going away. And I don't see that changing. And I think if you look at global, since we've really started to globalize, I don't think it's ever gone away, except for around major wars. And so, but it's had to adapt to the environment and what was going on. And every time there's an adaptation required, it takes pain because there's some dislocation and then reconstruction. I mean, it is not going to be easy for companies to re-architect their supply chains based on what we're seeing today. And you just talk about China, right? Just put everything else aside, for companies that have gone all in China, they're going to have to start to re-architect that and build capability in other places around the globe, probably largely here or in other places. And even with that, we're so intertwined with China, there's no way that we could completely unpack, nor could they. We're codependent on each other. Think about how hard it is to unwind from Russia. You know, with the war in the Ukraine and as much solidarity as there's been around that, it's been really hard to unwind that. So I don't think it's going away, but I do think it's changing. And I do think consulting firms are going to make a lot of money helping companies figure that out. So I think my pension's in good shape.
For the past couple of years, I was working in the semiconductor industry. So I got to see firsthand, a lot of companies announcing their move back to the US. So like Micron, as of yesterday, are going to be in upstate New York, TSMC in Phoenix, and Intel in Europe too. Isn't that nationalization, like every country wanting a fabrication facility of their own?
I think it to some degree is that, but I look at it as, again, if you look at something that's strategic to your, whether it's to your supply chain or to your security of your country, I would only outsource that to somebody that I knew was, completely politically aligned and in sync, that I trusted, and or I'd bring it home. Even if it cost me more money, even if I had to invest to rebuild capability, think about it. You understand how this happens, right? But all that capability was here, and then we offshored it and gave it away. Now but you have to rebuild it. And this is where the boards, governance from the board and the CEO, this is where they earn their money around things like this, right? And you make the case that says it's so fundamentally strategic, it's going to impact earnings for but this is going to set us up not for the next 3 or 4 years, but it's going to set us up for the next 50 years. And so that's what I think needs to happen. So yes, you can say it's nationalization, or I just spent a lot of my life doing strategy work, and I can't ever remember recommending to a client to be solely dependent on one place to source something that was critical to their secret sauce. And I'd certainly never to a country that was not in any way aligned with their objectives. And I think you've seen that. This is where I think governance comes in. A lot of the decisions get made are based on shorter term perspectives than are there. So. Yeah,
so that's a longer term goal perspective.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, so I'm encouraged by that. But just when you go look at chips are in everything, right? So how could you I wouldn't do that. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I can make a comment on this, is partly because of COVID and the chip shortages, it has really exposed how vulnerable the U.S. economy is. Because right now, I was on the talk show yesterday about car manufacturing. So now you buy a new car, you can get a car, but it's incomplete. It may not have a USB port, may not have a heated seat and whatnot. Through the US history, it's never happened before, but now it's happening. So in order to make sure that the United States has a secure supply chain, just in case, now Janet Yellen is calling for friendshoring. Maybe it may not be reshore all the way to the United States, maybe friendshoring by taking advantage of, for example, would be like the USMCA free trade agreement. Before it's a NAFTA, I call NAFTA Part 2, right? So therefore, that will also solve the cheap labor issues. So I think that that is where the country is evolving. But not only United States, many other countries doing the same thing as well. They have their own trading blocks. So as we pointed out earlier, is the globalization is not ending, but it's changing shape. Mm-hmm. Maybe a little trading blocks, and they're friendly with each other. So I think that is taking shape right now. Yeah.
Yeah, in many ways, COVID may have highlighted some things that had we not addressed now would have been much more problematic 5, 6 years, 10 years from now. But we definitely have to catch up. It's probably something that should have been worked on a decade ago.
The question I have is, with all the rapid innovation going on in a variety of sectors like healthcare, tech, everywhere, transportation, I don't see the regulation catching up that fast.
Yeah.
How do you think that globally governments have to come together to work on regulations nationally as well as globally? The race to Mars and Moon is a good example there. How do you think that's going to play out?
Boy, getting global governments to get together to sort through regulation. Again, that's like kind of getting getting right. Kids kind of employed. But I think that one. I guess I'm probably more nationalistic around. I think there's more opportunity. What gets me excited is when I see innovation centers kind of emerging around the globe. And so there's innovation coming from different places. That it is. So how many people have spent time out, largely outside the U.S.? A lot of people here, right? So you've had these. The one thing that really stands out in this country is the infrastructure on innovation. It really just does. I would say in the last 10 years, I saw that emerging in pockets around the globe as well. And so I guess I don't know how to solve all the global kind of connections. We have enough trouble with tax regulation and other things. And if anything, I think what happens is you do start to see national trends to try to protect countries for that. But I do think spurning innovation in these, or spawning innovation in these different countries and having that come out is probably the more logical answer around that. So I don't have a good answer. That was a C minus, I think, in terms of my answer on that one. Tony, probably would have failed me on that. When you get into politics, that's not my strong suit. I just have to admit.
Curious, Chris, sort of building on your comments regarding the MCA, I'm curious to know, like, where is this globalization going to bring us close, bring manufacturing to South America, to Central America, maybe into sub-Saharan Africa? Do you see that as a way of bring, to take advantage of labor arbitrage?
Well, you asking Chris or me?
I guess both of you.
You're the global person.
Yeah, look, I think the answer is yes. I'd put more around Latin and South America first than sub-Saharan Africa.
Why is that?
Pardon?
Why?
I just think that in terms of the maturity of that marketplace, it's further behind, and it's much harder to get the lift there that there is here. I also think that there are benefits of Latin and South America being closer to the North American marketplace. We already have some of that in play with NAFTA and other things. Look, we looked long and hard at those marketplaces, and we made some major investments there. For us, it was more of a talent play than a go-to-market play. So, but I think that's a natural. I think it's a natural place to go. I do think those countries, we need some way to encourage those countries to become more business friendly, and that's where rule of law, corruption, all those things get in the way of those countries really flourishing as part of this. And so, but I think it's more logical, and I think yes. I always thought Africa was still about 10 years out.
You said Africa?
Yeah, we did a lot in certain markets there, and we had some phenomenal talent, in parts of Africa. But there's a lot of things that have to get done first.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, maybe you can supplement a little bit in terms of Africa. I think it depends on the industry.
Sure.
If you talk about in terms of high tech or car manufacturing, then USMCA make more sense because closer to the US markets. Now, you talk about in terms of more low tech because it's dealing with infrastructure. If you talk about apparel industry, actually Ethiopia is booming.
Yeah.
Because they serve the European markets, is closer to Europe. So actually, there is some kind of economic growth in certain sectors, but not all. So in that case, there is still opportunity in Africa.
So Chris brings up a good point. I looked at every country through an industry lens and a B2C, BD lens. So, Africa is, I think, much better in lower tech, B2C. The tech stuff that was interesting in Africa were opportunities where you could go into that marketplace and just kind of leapfrog these certain infrastructure investments. So there's pretty interesting innovation around some of the digital solutions there. So it really just depends. I mean, it's fair. I was reading that more in terms of labor for the harder manufacturing. So.
That's right.
And you guys talked about a lot of sexy products like semiconductors, a lot of different things. But to that point, we invested a lot. I'm in a global supply chain management company. We invested a lot in the Madagascar and Ethiopia and Kenya. We can't go to Ethiopia now because they just lost their duty-free status. So they got kicked out because of the political issues. But anyways, I was going to ask, what is your forecast or your stance on the global supply chain in African countries right now? A lot of our customers are going away from Asia. They don't appreciate all the stuff taking place now. They're coming either to USMCA area or AGOA places where growth opportunities taking place in Africa. So I want to take your thoughts and your ideas to what do you expect growth to be in African countries for low-tech industry? I think you just answered that question, but I want to get your thought on.
No, I don't know about growth percentages, but I think it'll be higher for that there than it will be for some of the higher tech stuff. And I think it'll depend on which markets you're going into, right? I think for access, were your supply chain for access into the North American marketplaces, or
Yes.
what it was? Okay. I think for certain sectors, yes, as Chris was saying, I think it will play out, but I don't see it, in the more mature sectors where it takes a huge amount of infrastructure being the first place you go. But I think it's possible.
Yeah, I'd like to make one comment in
Yeah,
terms
go
of
ahead.
Africa, Kevin. I think that besides low tech in terms of the apparel industry, and I think there's one market that is really still booming in Africa is mobile finance.
Yeah, that's
So
where
in Kenya, starting with the M-Pesa is in terms of digital currencies, and then the mobile money. And I think that right now Africa is really trying to transform the financial services because many unbanked people they in Africa. But that means it's a golden opportunity how to enter that market, provide the services to help them. So I do see that that one does not require a lot of big footprints, does not require a lot of infrastructure, but you can leverage the existing mobile network, right? I'm not talking about 5G, it's not there yet. But I think 3G or 4G will go a long way. So I think that there is opportunity in Africa.
To that point, the first real foray into that space for us globally was South Africa. For just that, mobile payments, there's a lot. I mean, that's where I think you have an opportunity just to skip over steps around Africa. So look, I think Africa eventually is going to be a major player. There's huge opportunity. I just think there's some basic foundational things that we have to be realistic about in that country. And in very targeted ways, yes, but it's not going to be as holistic. I think Latin and South America are further along in their maturation. I think they both have issues around being business friendly, political stability, all those things that have to get addressed as well.
So more because of the infrastructure that they're lacking.
Yeah, infrastructure, education, rule of law, all those things make it harder. You have to factor that in as a company when you're thinking about that.
Professor, you had a webinar, I think more than one, on digital currencies, especially the digital yuan. And we took a global emerging course with Chile where we slightly touched on Chile wanting to do a digital currency. what is your take on globalization of cryptocurrency and digital currencies and the future of it going forward, especially with the U.S. wanting to classify it as security or not, trying to regulate it or not, especially with like Coinbase and other companies getting, or Binance getting, regulated heavily and all of that.
It's a question for me or for
For,
him?
well, for you,
first.
Professor. and then
You go first and I'll pile on.
All right, let me give you a short answer. I will welcome you to join us for the event in November.
Future advertising.
We have a joint event with the UCLA Law School. We talk about in terms of cryptocurrency, the future, and also in terms of regulations. So that was a short answer because it will take 1 hour to answer that. Okay, so in real time, I'm going to wrap up this evening's sessions, and then we can continue our discussion. So, Jim, we thank you so much for spending the time with us, sharing your insight, your experience, your wisdom with us. So what I learned from you is that global is not going away anytime, but it's taking a different form, different shape. And also in your MBA education, please consider in terms of getting some global exposure. And our Center for Global Management, we have a lot of global immersion classes in different countries for you to consider. We are here to serve you. We want to provide the best in terms of education you can get, especially when COVID is over. Let's hope so. Also, we learn from you in terms of the automation, innovation. We should not be afraid of that because that is always, through history, is always create new jobs, which is very true. I have empirical evidence. During the Industrial Revolution, they said, wow, my God, when you have machinery, then where do we need to work as? It changed. Now we have more cars, more machines, and actually creating people to make them machine. So I met the founder of Kiva Robots. He's an MIT grad, months, and he sold Kiva Robots to Amazon. Then I said, well, that means there are no jobs there. He said, no, we still need people to make the robots. Right? So in the case, that would be another chain that would actually spawn. So therefore, I think that I agree with you. Listening to you, I'm much more optimistic that globalization is not ending. It's a new beginning. So on this note, I want to thank all of you and thank our online audience joining us this evening. And I think that we'll continue our discussions after the event.